And with that, I'll just sort of broadly introduce RSI for people who have no idea who we are, and that's probably some on the phone. We're a consulting firm based in Ottawa headquarters, but we have a group around Toronto and in Winnipeg, as I mentioned. We have sort of three major business lines, one which I generally call risk-based decision-making, which is the one that is largely overlapping with CFIA, typically over the years. There's another group distinctly related to climate change adaptation. That's the group that you're largely talking to today. And then there's another group related to toxicology and epidemiology, which doesn't overlap with today. So I'll just jump right in to the introductory slides. And so I've done the introduction. I'm just going to give you a backgrounder on this software product that we're describing today. We're going to give some examples of the use of that product for questions that we've just basically been given by CFIA people saying, this might be interesting. So that's essentially all we've done. And then we'll use that sort of to motivate the idea that this might be useful to you. And we'll also give some examples, and we'll do a demo of the actual software on the screen so you can see how it actually works. Hopefully by the end of that, we'll have some Q&A session. So go ahead, Norm. I'm just going to quickly refer to the fact that we have a number of other tools so we're going to present one tool called the Climate Change Hazards Information Portal, but we have a whole sort of suite of tools, some of which are highly relevant to your mandate and some less so. One is related to forensic analysis, so when something happened, what were the conditions around that period that caused that to happen? So that is in general relevant to what you might be interested in. We've done some work with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and other groups on an agricultural adaptation framework. And so, for example, there's some studies of the northern clay belt. Can it support pasture land for livestock, even though it may not at this moment, maybe it would in 30 years, for example, questions like that. And I'll skip over the rest of that slide. Norman will just go quickly ahead. Basically, the CHIP tool is basically a web page, but behind the web page is terabytes of data. Okay, and the terabytes of data comes from basically every piece of data that Environment Canada has ever collected and stored. The publicly available Environment Canada data set is behind under the hood, as well as all 40 of the well, multiple generations of, but all 40 of the more recent global climate projection models. So there's 40 sort of, like, would you call them endorsed, Norman? Endorsed models around the world, and all 40 of their projections covering the whole of Canada are the data we have on the server. So that's what you're querying is both history and the future projections. Okay? So that's, I think that's enough for that slide. One of the things that we think is important, it complements and enhances both the federal and regional climate offerings. So the purpose of it is largely to make things a whole lot easier to do than you can do by going with your own two hands to get Environment Canada data from Environment Canada servers, downloading a CSV file, uploading it into Excel. You can imagine that process being onerous. I'm sure some of you have had to do that. The other thing is it sort of creates a laying playing field. This not so much relevant to this group, but the idea is that climate change information would be just as accessible to a small municipality as it is to the City of Toronto's when people are trying to study climate change impacts. So that's another aspect of it. And of course, being easy to use, and that's always a relative term, but I think anybody who's had to do this type of analysis will know, and once they've been through the demo, how much easier this is. So next slide. And this slide here on the screen, if you look at the sort of series of steps to the right, is kind of the steps that you're able to skip over with the software. You go straight to getting the answers rather than having to do all of those aspects of dealing with the original historical data sets and all of the foibles associated with that, missing data, incorrect data, all of that sort of has been cleansed and cleaned and dealt with, and also dealing with the details of all of the projections and so on. So there's a whole lot of work that no longer need be done with this tool. So that's what we're hoping is the point of it. And this has been developed over about 4 years, give or take, and we released it essentially last year as a tool in the public domain. We have always essentially had this tool for ourselves because people would ask questions and we needed the means to give the answers, but we decided to make the same. By giving it a web interface, we make the process available to others. So CHIP is kind of, in one sense, it's a product in that you can just get a license to it, or it's also a service in that you can say, yeah, that's great that you have this tool, but I don't want to learn how to use it, so just do it for me. So that's the other way of thinking about it. And that's how some of our clients just use it themselves, and some of our clients use it with our help. So that's generally how it works. Next slide. So it's a web-based analytical tool. One of the things you'll see in it, which you'll see references to planning and design requirements as stipulated in national codes and standards. I know that there are national codes and standards for agricultural buildings as well. I'm pretty sure there are anyway. But in general, a series of codes and standards have sort of been built into the tool, and a lot of what you see in CHIP is basically things that have been the result of client requests. So rather than magically predicting what everybody else might need, we just sort of go where the questions are. So we've obviously been asked a lot of questions about engineering infrastructure, so you'll see some of that within it because that's where a lot of questions are. You know, what would be a maximum snow load to expect in Halifax? You know, questions like that. And as we've mentioned, it has national coverage, so it does cover the entire country, every meteorological station and interpolation of everywhere in between, based on this so-called CAN grid system, which someone more knowledgeable than me could explain later if you had a question. It's also the other thing is we've basically adopted Environment Canada's QA and QC procedures for the data analysis. Some of our staff used to be Environment Canada staff, so they know of what they speak. And the methods particularly when it comes to applying the climate change projections on top of historical data, that's done using sort of peer-reviewed methods. We're actually undergoing a peer review right now as sort of mandated by the Standards Council of Canada, because this is going to be important in setting national standards, particularly for infrastructure. They wanted sort of a peer review. They've set up an expert panel to review it and so on. So that's a process that's underway right now, hopefully done within a couple of months. And with that, I think I'll move to the last slide. The tool is sort of continually expanding. Basically, every time we get a new question, we tend to be building a new feature into the tool. So, for example, some of the questions that we were thinking about with respect to the zoonotic agents or the invasive plants that we were looking at, some of those questions could be answered immediately using the tool, and some could be answered if the tool were tweaked a bit. And that's just about the case for every client interaction we have, is that there's some tweaking to be done, and then that just becomes a new feature of the tool for anybody else to use. So the other thing is that when we fully expect that people are not going to be able to use it without any help whatsoever, so there is actually online support. It's a proper piece of software where you can pick up the phone. So with that, I think that's the end of my talk, and we'll move over to Norman, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to walk you through two examples that we've kind of used here to show potential applications for vector-borne disease within CHIP, and then so one of these will kind of be static, and then the other one I'll take you to a live demo of the website so you can see what it looks like and how it functions. The first example here is going to be essentially black lead ticks. that can transmit many different types of disease. We know Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, there are others out there now. And from literature, we know there are a few different thresholds, obviously. We're going to take a very basic one here, something that we can do very quickly with CHIP, to say, what is the lethal temperature at which, if we get below this in the winter, it should kill off most ticks. This is based on a laboratory study, so they don't have snow cover, they don't have, but play along, if you will. Essentially, what we're talking about here is a temperature threshold of -11. So if we can have a daily temperature of -11 as a minimum temperature, that should be a threshold that would be enough to at least kill off at least some of the population, if not most. And obviously, this is going to be a simplified example. There are a lot more moving parts. We know that for all of these things. But it's a proof of concept, so we can expand upon this type of work. So these are some of the example types of outputs that you can get from CHIP. So in the top picture here, or top figure, you'll see a blue set of bars, and then the red line there. Red line is the trend line from historical observations, and this is an example using Ottawa. We could use any station that has data here. We're using Ottawa. We have data back to 1938 for Ottawa to 2017. And then these wintertime minimum temperatures. So what I'm showing you in this chart is counts of days where the minimum temperature is above -11. So what that would tell us is that if we're increasing the number of days that we're above -11, we would be not able to kill off as many of these ticks. So the idea here is you can see a positive trend. You can see an increase in the number of days that are warmer as a minimum temperature. And as you go into the future, so the right side of that top bar graph, any of the three vertical bars to the right, so that's the 2020s. I don't know if the mouse will work if I put it on the screen. So this is kind of our 1980 to 2010 mean. This is the 2020s, 2050s, and 2080s as in terms of number of days that are above that threshold. So you can see by the end, on average, by the end of the 2080s, we see about 60 to 70 days that are above that temperature threshold. This could be used for multiple different types of pests. This can be used for not just this one example. I'll show you one other chart that might make this a little bit easier to see if you can't see it in the bar graphs. The histogram on the bottom here essentially shows you the creeping of the mean temperature for those minimum temperatures. So on the right side, the furthest over, this is kind of the historical mean, the blue one. The red one that's in the middle, that's the 2080s. So you can see every time slice that we go forward, that whole mean shifts. And you can also see it in this chart here. So by the time that you are in the 2080s, the mean minimum temperature is a -5, and even your 25th percentile minimum temperature is warmer than that threshold value that you need. So that gives you an example of two really quick ways that we can address this type of thing with CHIP as it is current. We can easily build in more functionality to look at more information. Second example here, and this is going to take me out of this presentation and into a live demo here in a second, but talking about blue tongue virus vector. Essentially, the biting midge that transmits blue tongue virus. We know that this has been an issue in Europe, and we're wondering how much of an issue might this be going forward in this area. Many studies out there suggest that a mean annual temperature threshold of 12.5 degrees C. There are some more recent studies that refine that even higher, but we'll use the 12.5 degrees C to be kind of conservative in this sense. And then recent studies have a whole series of different temperatures, but this one's from 2014, so it's pretty recent. And this would be essentially 12.5 degrees C. If we're above that, we say, okay, the midge can be present. If it's below that, we would say it can't survive. And that's the annual average temperature. So this is where I'm going to jump out to show you how this works in real life. So give me 1 second. Hopefully it pops up on the screen here. It's going to be kind of tiny, so I'll do my best. So we're going to use two different places. We're going to use Ottawa and Victoria as an example. You notice I'm only using specific locations. One of the things that would probably be of interest to everybody is looking at it on a countrywide map. That's functionality that we need to build into CHIP as well, but it is in development currently. So we're using Ottawa at the moment. You'll notice it says annual mean temperature. There's a few nice little features here. We can change very easily the time of year. So if you're interested in only January, you can pick January. We're going to use annual. And I'll scroll down here. One of the really neat things is that we have this threshold value. I'm leaving it off for now because we don't need it at the moment, but we're interested in 12.5 degrees C. So we want to see if there's a point where we exceed 12.5 degrees C in, say, Ottawa, where we would have to worry about this midge on a regular basis. And if we go down here, so here's the chart. This is kind of interactive as you mouse over it, so you can see there's quite a bit of interannual variability, but in general, an upward trend over the last 50 to 60 years at least. And if we look at the 1981 to 2010 baseline, the average annual temperature for Ottawa is only 6 degrees. As we get towards the 2080s, the ensemble mean would give you 11.88 degrees, so we're still not actually hitting that value, which might be good news for Ottawa. If you look down here, this will show you some of the kind of ideas of uncertainty and the spread of all the models. So we talked about 40 models. All 40 models are represented inside these box plots. So you can see each one of these is a specific model. And it gives you the box plot, the full spread, the median values in the middle here, and then kind of the percentiles on either side of that. So you can watch that change. Now, if we go to a different location, it jumped off Victoria really quick. Little low. This is what it does when it retrieves data. It retrieves data for you. It's usually very quick. Hopefully really very quick. There we go. The example here, same idea, mean annual average temperature. We know Victoria should probably be a little bit warmer than Ottawa on average. Lo and behold, good, it is. The average over the last 30 years is about 10 degrees. As we jump forward to the 2020s, we see it's 11, and to the 2050s, this is using RCP 8.5, the most aggressive emission scenario. We exceed that 12.5 value by the mid-21st century, and we're definitely above it by the end of it. So that gives you an idea of some of the functionality that we can do right now, right within CHIP. I'll go back to the current slide. And you can look at this too. We can, similar type of thing, dump out a couple charts that give you the values and the mean values, and I highlighted in red. As soon as we start jumping above those values, most of the models there would agree with 25% of the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile. We're well within the range of blue tongue in an area like Victoria. And with that, that's the end of my slides. I got to figure out how to jump it over to Neil. I don't know how to unmute somebody, I guess. Is there a way to do that?
Oh, you guys are going to just continue through the slide deck, and I'm going to tell you to advance.
Sounds good. Thanks, Neil.
Okay, great. Thank you for those specific examples, Norm. What I'm going to do is provide the group with a basic overview of the CHIP tool as it is now, and many of the different features that may be of use to you. By no means is this demo a demonstration of all possibilities within CHIP, because as Greg mentioned before, we're talking about terabytes of data and many different variables, and there would never be any time in a demonstration to cover everything. So I'll just cover some main points here for you in the next few slides. Next, please. The way CHIP is designed, we try to make it as user-friendly as possible because, as Greg mentioned, we're trying to provide climate change information to a fairly wide audience, some that are knowledgeable about climate change, other consulting companies, for example, and people that are tasked with providing climate change information that aren't educated at all in climate change. So the way we've designed it, enter in your email address that you were assigned and your password, and click Login. Next, please. The next ask is simply your location of interest. If you're licensed with CHIP, typically we have set up your location of interest already. But what happens here is you would start typing in your location name and it would fill in with a list of possibilities below and you would simply pick one. Next, please. Also within CHIP, we filter the variables that are available to you by sector because some of the variables may not at all be relevant to your particular interest. So here for this group, probably infrastructure variables are of less interest to you. So those types of variables, if the health selection is made, those infrastructure type variables wouldn't be listed. At this point, the way CHIP operates, though, in our initial stages, is that everyone can have access to all different sector variables from a drop-down menu within the tool, which I'll show you next. So when you first log in, you start off with the location that you typed in at the beginning. That's the top left. The default variable is mean annual temperature. We just looked at mean annual temperatures from norms demonstration. And in the top right, you can see the observation station that CHIP has automatically picked for you based upon the location you typed in. So you can type in a location that doesn't have a MET station, of course, and the system will look for the closest one that's available to you and provide that to you in the top right. At the bottom of the chart, you can see a slider where you can click the left and right dots and adjust the period that you want to display on the chart. And as you make that adjustment of period length, the chart will redraw and the trend line will redraw to reflect the period that you've selected. Next, please. As Norm mentioned before, in addition to annual, of course, you can pick individual months to plot or seasons. And across the top on all of our screens, on our dashboard screens, you have the dashboard, which is the default view, favorites, where you can favorite different variables, and then when you next log in, you can go to favorites and repick that variable for display. My account is some basic accounting for your login, like changing password and things like that. Documentation is a lengthy file that describes the variables we have on the system, how they're calculated. Updates is a tab where we indicate every month what we have changed and updated on the site. There's also Contact Us, a web form where you can click on it at any time, send a question to us, and we attempt to answer that typically within one day, one business day. Of course, the whole site is available in French as well. Next, please. So in addition to mean annual temperature that we looked at, there are also many other different temperature variables, and that's all available to you through a drop-down. So there's maximum and minimum temperatures and time series, daily time series, that is, not just annual. Histogram showing the distribution of temperatures into various bins, extreme temperatures, and percentile temperatures, which are useful for some studies as well. Next, please. This is an example of the histogram output. We're still here in Toronto, and we said, show me the histogram distribution of daily mean temperature. And when you do that, it provides you with something like this, with different bins and the distribution of those daily temperature values over the period that you have selected. This is particularly useful for some of our clients that are doing Monte Carlo analysis where they need the initial historical distributions of temperature to run through their own modeling process. Next, please. In addition to the standard variables of temperature and precipitation and wind, you'll see on the left there's also a complex variables section I'm going to show you some of those complex variables in a moment. Above that box, as I mentioned earlier, is the sector selector. That's the filter that we apply to restrict variables that are visible to you based upon your sector of interest. The way the system, as I mentioned, is set up right now initially is that you can simply move from one sector to the next by using that drop-down and switching, like, for example, from infrastructure to agriculture or to natural resources. And different variables will be available to you. Of note, we're still building out variables within other sectors. We have many variables that are available to you under infrastructure and agriculture, and many of the other variables are still being built in the other sectors. But infrastructure and agriculture variables, many of those are also of interest to the other health and natural resources sectors as well. Next, please. Further on the left menu dashboard, we have a full list of all of the different variables that are available on the site. This depends upon the station that you have selected. Of course, not all variables are available at all locations. Next, please. In addition to your initial location that the system automatically picks for you, in the top right menu, if you click the little info button to the right, it will provide you with a list of neighboring MET stations that you may also select. And they're ordered by proximity. So you see the next closest station at the top of the list, and they become progressively further and further away. For climate change studies, it's important to have long records of historical data to establish the historical climate. And so we've color-coded each one of these stations, with green being the stations with the longest period of record, yellow, intermediate periods of record, and red are stations with very short periods of record, which are less reliable for establishing the historical climate. Importantly, at the bottom here, we have the CAN grid data set that Greg mentioned earlier. This is a data set developed by Environment Canada and Natural Resources Canada that interpolates smartly between Environment Canada stations at 10-kilometer resolution across all of the Canadian landmass. So where there are no Environment Canada stations, it is possible to select CAN grid as your, quote, station, unquote, and the system will operate with that CAN grid daily data just as if it was a station. Next, please. Norm showed you this earlier. This is an important tool that we've used in much of our analysis, and that's the threshold tool. So up until now, we've only been showing you basically, in my demo here, just the raw climate data, the temperature or the precip. But what the threshold tool allows you to do is to toggle it on from its default value of disabled to greater than or less than, and then use that slider, that dot across the top, to define the actual threshold that is of interest to you. Previously, we used a threshold of 12, for example, for mean annual temperature. And once this tool is toggled on, then instead of the actual value of temperature, it then provides on a yearly basis the count of number of days that that threshold has been either exceeded or not reached, depending on if you pick greater than or less than. This can be important for precipitation and infrastructure. If we know that there are issues with extreme precipitation, say for example over 25 millimeters in one day, as in this example, we can say, okay, give me the count of days per year that we have had greater than 25 millimeters of precip per day, and it will plot it. When we're talking about health, we can do threshold checks for temperature. So where there's heat stress in human populations due to excess heat, we can say, okay, under the temperature option selected, we can say, give me a count of the number of days per year over 30, and then we'll get counts and historical trends on that type of thing. Next, please. So now we're talking about climate change. So this is the first time we've shown some climate change projections in the demo, and that's easily obtained on the system by clicking the Show Projection Data when available. So when that's toggled on, you have the option at this point of picking the low emission scenario pathway, 4.5, or the business as usual pathway of greenhouse gas emissions going forward, which is RCP 8.5. Importantly, so far, historically, we have absolutely been on the RCP 8.5 trend, and barring any sudden global agreements on greenhouse gas emissions, it would appear that RCP 8.5 is where we're headed. So when that's toggled on, what you're provided with in the graph below is a green bar, which represents the average historical value, and then 3 bars to the right, which represent the 2020s, 50s, and 80s projected value from all of our terabytes of global climate models that we have combined together to come up with an ensemble average change. Next, please. As Norm showed you previously, in addition to just the ensemble mean, we also provide you with the distribution of all of those model projections. So you don't just have one number. You can see what the full range of all of those 40 models are. We provide you on that chart previously with just the ensemble mean, the middle of the box, but you can see that there are a whole range of projections from each one of those models as shown by the box and whisker plots here. So we divide the box and whisker plots up into the 2020s column, 2050s there in the middle, and 2080s to the right. Not surprisingly, as we go further into the future to the 2080s, the range of projected values expands. There's greater uncertainty. That's why the whiskers in that plot in the far right are much further apart than that of the 2020s. Next, please. We are working currently on mapping within the system. Currently, we have the coarse GCM mapping for the location you've entered, as seen on the left-hand side, for the 2020s, 50s, and 80s. What we're working on right now is the high-resolution mapping that you see for Nova Scotia in this example on the right. This uses the high-resolution CAN grid data of 10-kilometer resolution, so there's a data point every 10 kilometers. We apply the climate change value or change to that 10-kilometer grid point and then replot the map. As you can imagine, we're talking about thousands and thousands of points to plot. Right now, on our dev site, the mapping at this high resolution isn't acceptably fast, so we're working on the optimization of that mapping routine. We're getting there. We've definitely been able to optimize it from what it was initially, so that will be coming, the high resolution plotting over areas, spatial areas, not just for a single point. I'm going to show you, coming up in a few moments, an example of some development work that we're doing right now on mapping to show you the change in range of some invasive species going forward under climate change. Next, please. And here it is. The first example is going to be we were provided with the kudzu vine, which is taking over the south and progressively moving north. What we found in our literature review is that there are several criteria that are favorable for this invasive species. Mild winters ranging from 5 to 15 degrees Celsius mean winter temperature, hot summers over 25 C, and at least 100 centimeters of precipitation. So there's 3 criteria, and what I'll demonstrate is our mapping techniques looking at the historical range of where these conditions were met, and then the future ranges for the 2050s and 2080s of where these conditions will be met. So next slide, please. So the first condition here is for annual precipitation over 100 centimeters, which is equivalent, of course, to 1,000 millimeters per year. On this map of North America, we start with the now map at the top left, The green area on that map represents areas that receive greater than 1,000 millimeters of precipitation. So this is where the condition for kudzu is met currently on the precipitation criteria. In the middle, you see where that criteria has expanded in eastern Canada. You can see that it's expanded further northward into Quebec and southern Ontario by the 2050s. And then by the 2080s, on the bottom right, you can see that it's expanded even further. So this fits along with our projections of increased precipitation on a mean annual basis for the eastern part of North America. Next, please. Here is the temperature condition, mean summer temperature of greater than 25 Celsius. So what we see here again in the top left is where we have a mean summer temperature of over 25 in green, basically restricted to the U.S. southeast. In the 2050s, you see it expanding further north into the Midwest area, approaching Canada, certainly touching upon the southwestern part of southern Ontario. And then by the 2080s, in the bottom right graph, you can see how the mean summer temperature of 25 Celsius is definitely into southern Ontario and southern Quebec, according to the Climate Ensemble projection. Next, please. And then finally, the third condition that I spoke of earlier, this is a winter temperature, mean temperature between 5 and 15 degrees Celsius. And again, the areas that meet that condition are shown in green. You can see historically it's basically in the south. In the 2050s, shifting further north, and in the 2080s, continue to shift further north. But this criteria is not really met anywhere in Canada except for the west coast of British Columbia by the 2050s and 2080s. Not so much in southern Ontario. But this is only one criteria of 3, remember. Next, please. We do have extensive modeling experience within RSI where we have integrated our climate units and our health units specifically for work with public health. And some of the examples that we've integrated climate change into are for E. coli and leafy produce. That's the top left modeling, and you can see some of the linkages between climate and E. coli in that example. We've also worked previously on a project with Vibrio in Pacific oysters, and again, that involves climate change and water and ocean temperatures. And also, the third example here, mycotoxin in wheat, where we relate moisture to the growth of mycotoxin in wheat in central Canada. Next, please. And that brings us to the end of my quick demo through CHIP. As I mentioned, there are a lot of other features and variables which I didn't display here. We include databases on wind, on hurricane passages, on tornado frequencies, many different types of variables which I didn't get into here today. So thanks very much for your interest.
Thank you.
Nothing more to say.
So I'm sure there's probably lots of questions. We'll open it up on the phone. Are there any questions?
This is Amir Fazil with EHAC. I just had a question about the availability of the data. You showed the gridded data. There's a slowdown in the ability to map it, but if you wanted to download all gridded data for a large geographic region, I guess of the 10-kilometer range, is that possible?
Right now, we don't provide the capability to download that gridded data, that CAN grid data that I talked of earlier. Probably part of the reason, well, not probably, but I know part of the reason for that is that since the CanGrid data is publicly available already, I believe it goes against licensing agreements for us to simply redistribute that gridded data from another organization. It's certainly well within our rights and anyone's rights to download the data, manipulate, plot it up, do some calculations as we do here, but I believe just simply downloading the data by RSI and then redistributing it goes against the distribution rules.
Thanks.
Maybe we'll, anyone in the room have any questions?
You have many different future projections, assuming like different GCMs and scenarios, A and B scenarios involved in them. Is there any way that you can combine them to give an overall average view or a view that shows the uncertainty inherent in those models?
Sure, and that's kind of what we're doing. When the charts we showed earlier with the bars to the right for the 2020s, 50s, and 80s, those represent the model ensemble mean. So that's where we do take the projections from all 40 of the GCMs, combine them together, come up with the average change of all of them, and that's the value that we plot on our charts. And then below it, I showed you the box and whisker plots, and those represent the actual model values that individually go into generating that ensemble average. So we do provide you with the full distribution of all of the models along with standard deviations and percentile distribution. So from that, you also have the information about the spread of the models and the uncertainty in those projections. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Have you guys had any conversation with the new Canadian Centre for Climate Services? Because I'm assuming a lot of the data that you have is coming from various government departments. So is there a long-term interest to try to collaborate from a whole of government perspective?
Yes, we are in conversations with that new group at Environment Climate Change Canada, active conversations about, they certainly are well aware of this tool, and they, frankly, are trying to figure out what to do with it. We're in very active discussions with them about that, which could go any number of ways, as you can imagine.
Hi, it's Linda Boba here from FAC. Just a question, so can we sign up for free, or is this a cost-based kind of signing up? Did I miss that?
No, we weren't going quite so far as to provide the brochure. Just to start the conversation, we have various licensing models, but there's also the opportunity to have what we call a free trial with a certain sort of a limited scope and a limited time frame, so that you can kick the tires, as I think people naturally want to do. The other option that we have is where you're not actually buying a license to the software per se. You would be actually buying a service, and then the license would be sort of provided as part of that, but the expectation is that you wouldn't be on your own. We would be working with you to achieve a particular outcome, and the license is just the means to the end of that other outcome. So I think you can think pretty broadly about what's possible, but at the very least, to answer your direct question, is yes, you can get a trial license for free.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, I've got a question. I'm just wondering, in your demo, you were looking at sort of climate variables separately. Just wondering if you could potentially combine different climatic factors together, so thresholds for temperature and rainfall, humidity, and then produce a map on like areas that fulfill the I guess, the thresholds for multiple criteria?
That's a great question. This is Neil. At the moment, we don't have the option to combine and overlay multiple thresholds, but that is certainly something that we are working on as we speak on our development side, so in behind the scenes. The complication there, of course, is the setup for display of selecting multiple variables at the same time and then clicking, you know, find the intersection of all of these criteria. But it's possible. We're working on it in behind the scenes. Good question.
Thank you.
I'll just add one bit of fact here while I've been waiting to see if another question erupts. But one of the things I mentioned, I think, in an email to Sharon initially is that one of the major hopes and uses of this in the Government of Canada is for emergency management. And as it turns out, Public Safety Canada bought a suite of licenses on behalf of the federal government and distributed them out to different departments based on their emergency management, I guess, perceived priorities. And Agriculture Canada, and therefore possibly CFIA, were excluded from that because of the official separation of emergency management responsibilities when it comes to agriculture. So they, you did not get on the list of people who might have gotten a free license from Public Safety, because others do. Natural Resources Canada, INAC has recently used it pretty extensively, and others with this free license.
What about with Public Health Agency of Canada have been part of Public Safety?
I don't remember. Good question, but I don't remember if Public Health Agency was one. And it may have been given to Health Canada instead of the Public Agency. I can't really be sure. Neil, I don't know if you remember if Public Health Agency is on that list?
I don't believe so. I believe it was Health Canada.
Right.
Do you have a slide with a list of variables that are in your program? Maybe climate variables and such? Just wondering, because one thing that's very relevant from our viewpoint is soil temperature at various depths, soil temperature underneath the snow depth, and that's not easy to find anywhere, though I know it's collected by Environment Canada. I'm wondering if you have access to that.
I can answer that question. Soil temperatures are measured at only a very few stations by Environment Canada, typically not at all. So that data is difficult to get. I would agree with that. What I can add about soil temperatures is that there are some empirical formula out there that can relate air temperature to various soil temperatures at depth. That's a possibility. But right now, we do not have soil temperature measurements on the system. Your second question was about snow on ground, is that right?
The depth of snow, yes.
Yeah, again, that's another variable that is available, and we do have, but it's only measured typically at airport station locations across Canada. So we do have that. We do have the snow on ground measurements from the airport locations.
But then to extrapolate across the entire country is kind of tricky for that.
Oh, absolutely. The only way that possibly we could do any kind of interpolation about snow depth would be to probably use some type of model, some type of historical model that has calculated snow depth from all of its temperature and precipitation balances, which includes, of course, melting and accumulation in snow events. It's one of those variables that basically Environment Canada hasn't been focusing on, believe it or not, even though Canada is a land of snow. It's not a variable that has been typically collected at many locations at all, mostly just airports.
Okay.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. So my question is, like, as time passes, and obviously you move from real time to the projected model of data on a certain date in the future, is there plans to continually validate the models that are being used in terms of the outputs against the reality, and also to incorporate new models as they're developed for climate change?
Sure, I can answer that. The first part of the question was about model validation. And indeed, that's a tricky question, because when you ask how do you validate the model, well, basically it depends on the variable that you're interested in. So if it's temperature that interests you, you'll get an ordering of models and how well they do. If it's precipitation, you'll get a different ranking of models and how they do. So it goes on a variable-by-variable basis. There's been a lot of literature written on this type of thing, on just how you do evaluate a model. Do you look at all variables, or do you look at only one variable? And the tricky part with climate change is that you can't simply pick one model that does well for temperature and then pick another model that does well for precipitation, because, of course, precipitation and temperature are integrally linked. And so if you pick two separate models for your climate adaptation project, that could be a potentially unrealistic outcome because it may not be supported by nature. So the way we do get around it on the website is that what we do is we basically only look at the climate change signal. So we don't care how well the model has done historically at representing past climate. We're only interested in what's the difference from that model from the current climate and the future time periods in the future. So the temperature change from 1981 to 2010, between that and the 2050s, so that delta value. And then what we do is we apply that delta value or climate change value to an actual observed climate value, a Met station value. And so we apply that change. And so I hope you see that by using that delta technique, it doesn't really matter how well the model has represented the historical past, because we're only really interested in its climate change signal. So that's how we get around this whole model validation question. Your second question about the models themselves is that, for sure, at RSI we have a history of working with all of the previous GCM iterations. As you know, about every 6 or 7 years the IPCC comes out with a new climate change report. The most recent one was 2013. And it used the CMIP-5 assembly of models. Previous to that, there was the AR4 and the TAR set of models previous to that. The database we have includes all of those previous renditions as well, but the CHIP tool uses only the most recent assemblage of CMIP-5 models that were released most recently by the IPCC.
Thank you. That's very good.
You're welcome.
So I had a question about where you had the choice there for projections to choose RCP 4.5 or 8.5. I would have no idea which one to choose. Do you have something somewhere that describes the difference there, and are they then combining different models, or what's the difference?
I can handle that. On the top link on our website under documentation, there's a section in there that talks about these various RCPs. And basically what an RCP is, its official name is Representative Concentration Pathways, a nice mouthful. But what it basically describes are various different greenhouse gas concentration estimates going forward. And the reason why they're different, of course, depends upon if we have international agreements on the reduction of greenhouse gases, or if we don't. RCP 8.5 is the greatest climate warming, as Norm is showing here now, and that's basically the business as usual case, the one that we have been most closely following and continue to follow today, where we do have increased greenhouse gas concentrations being emitted into the atmosphere, and there's very little control or regulation. So in spite of any of these international agreements that we hear about, like, for example, the Paris Agreement most recently, none of these agreements have any basic teeth. So certainly everyone can go to the meeting and say, yes, we pledge to follow along on this international treaty, but basically there's no teeth saying that if you don't follow it, you're penalized. And of course, many nations, developing nations, are complaining that, well, why are you trying to restrict our own development? So we're not going to go along with that. So if we've done climate adaptation and risk assessments for various groups, and we're forced to select only one RCP, we have typically selected RCP 8.5 since that's the pathway we have been following and would appear to be continuing to follow. RCP 2.6 is basically unobtainable at this point. We've already exceeded the pathway that it describes. 4.5 is still possible to meet if we have immediate aggressive greenhouse gas reductions. 6 is still within reach, and 8.5, as I mentioned, would seem to be the most likely pathway going forward, sadly.
You referred to that, and it's colloquially referred to as business as usual, right, Norm? Or Neil?
Yes, that's correct. 8.5 is business as usual, where we continue to develop coal and burn other natural resources like oil and coal going forward.
Well, I think we've run out of time, but so if people have more questions or just want to find out more information, where should they go?
Well, they can obviously email any of us or call any of us, but the site itself has some contact information links there that would also get people through the process of signing up for a trial or whatever else people might want to do.
Okay. It's just chip.ca.
Yeah.
Okay.